Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average decklist as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. I realized that we haven't yet tackled a background commander in the Upping the Average series, and in honor of the recent Dungeons & Dragons movie, I think it's time that we had a party. Far and away, the most popular background commander pair on EDHREC is that of Burakos and Folk Hero from the Party Time pre-constructed deck. On attack, Burakos makes us treasures and automatically makes the defending player lose life for whatever party we have assembled. Combined with the Folk Hero, we'll usually draw one extra card per turn just by playing creatures, and it gets even better if any of them have flash to help trigger that background multiple times around. I know we say this about nearly every pre-constructed deck these days, but man, the Party Time Precon was gassed, y'all. Burakos' mana output is no joke, and all these tiny creatures seem inconsequential at first, but their little synergies pile up in huge ways. Plus, there'll always be some fun new Clerics or Warriors, etc. in every upcoming set for the rest of time, so this deck has a lot of life ahead of it. Let's get things underway by grabbing Burakos' average decklist from EDHREC and plugging it into the Architect deck building website. As always in this series, any swaps we make must either keep the total price of the list cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. I've gone ahead and divided this decklist into extra categories. One big clump of a bunch of creatures isn't really all that helpful for us after all. Instead, I find it's more helpful to zoom out and get a sense of our creature type breakdown to really see our party configuration possibilities. As we can see from the decklist, white and black are flourishing with great Clerics, but the number of wizards we have is quite small. This isn't a fatal flaw. Burakos can fill out any role in our party, after all. But it's a good thing to keep in mind, to know what the demands upon our decklist truly are, and which types we ought to prioritize when it comes to cuts and to additions. Also, of note, this is a creature-heavy deck, so our non-creature spots are very slim and therefore very precious. Let's get affiliated with our party guests. There are a ton of great creatures here, and many of the most obvious MVP cards address the party mechanic directly, like Nalia and Squad Commander or Harper Recruiter. Any card with flash deserves special attention, because Folk Hero triggers once each turn, so casting multiple creatures per round will net us extra card advantage. Vexillus Praetor is especially noteworthy for this purpose, having flash and also giving our commander protection so that Burakos can attack with ease and produce us tons of mana. That protection is huge, and that's totally the case also for Mother of Runes, or for the many keywords of the multi-class Baldric. These are just clutch. Even the flying buff from Archpriest of Iona comes in real handy to make sure that Burakos can safely proc the attack trigger. Honestly, so many of these creatures have small upsides here and there that just take the game plan to the next level. Protect the team with Selfless Spirit? Aces. Draw extra cards from Mindblade Render? Perfect! And then we can revive them later with cards like Savine's Reclamation and friends like that. And the multi-typed cards are awesome too, like Mage's Attendant giving us a rogue and a wizard, or the Changeling creatures, filling out any role we need them to be. Crib Swap is especially hilarious because it's technically a Changeling, so it removes a creature and draws us a card. That's awesome. Mirror Entity, one of my favorites, is a wonderful game ender. In fact, the whole suite of game enders is just kind of hilarious to me. Jazal Goldmane, that's another huge favorite of mine, a warrior who will pump up the whole team. And this deck generates so many treasures that we could activate that ability multiple times. Or we make so many treasures that Revel in Riches is no joke, and have absolutely KO'd people with that Starlit Sanctum card. It's legit. Oh, and Stick Together might just be one of the coolest thematic board wipes I've ever seen. It really puts this precon over the top. So okay, we've got our bearings, but now how do we zhuzh up this party? Well, for one thing, we'll definitely have a budget version of the deck list at the end of the video. But for now, what I want to focus on is, indeed, finding our focus. This deck is spinning a lot of different plates. It cares about balancing out a bunch of different creature types, and then it also cares about treasure production, and then it also cares about having payoffs and synergies for tiny creatures rather than for big creatures. And that's all just kind of a lot of disparate effects to stuff into a single deck list, you know? And those things don't always overlap with each other. The original precon was super solid. Like, I'm not even going to make all that many changes to this average deck list, to be honest. But this deck wins by sanding off edges. It has this approach of incremental value and accumulating things that way. And, you know, I think that's how we can approach our upgrades for this deck too. We have a greater number of Clerics than any other creature type, so I'm going to be a little more critical of these. There are 3 that won't make it overall, but I'll just address 2 to start. Order of Whiteclay and Bygone Bishop. I actually like the Bishop, but since the latest Dominaria set, Takesia's Welcome is a bigger player in the deck now, and I think the Bygone Bishop has proven a little slow in comparison. As for the Order of Whiteclay, I have no personal love for this card. We can revive things at a much faster and more reliable pace than this, and that untap requirement is just kind of awkward anyway. Moving on briefly from the Clerics, the Warriors are interesting too, but Mardu's Strike Leader keeps bugging me. It makes tokens, but it's the same type of token, and this is an attack trigger, which is A, slow, and B, isn't reliable, because we don't always have a safe attack for the Strike Leader to make without dying just to get a token. That dash ability is also not of great interest to us for that much mana. So sorry Strike Leader, but sayonara. But you know which warrior I do like here? Yeah, Nadir's Nightblade. I love you. I love you. A warrior that pings all our enemies whenever our tokens go away, and our commander regularly creates like 3 or 4 treasure tokens every turn. This card is genuinely terrifying in this list. Nickel and dime our enemies with our nickel and dimes. This is so excellent. Okay, from here on out, the cuts are going to get wordy and complicated and possibly controversial, so stick with me, okay? I don't care for Maskwood Nexus in this deck. I really, really don't like it, actually. It's a guarantee that any 4 creatures we have will always be a full party, but every time that I found it in my hand, I already had a regular full party, just naturally anyway. I already had a Cleric, Rogue, Warrior, and Burakos usually filling out for a Wizard. So the Maskwood ability turning everything into every creature type was just unnecessary. Like, at best, it turned my team of Cleric, Rogue, and Burakos into a party of 4 instead of a party of 3, but I don't know, that tiny tick up never felt particularly game-changing for 4 whole mana. And no, I also never found the Changeling token production ability very helpful either. This card wound up being a security blanket rather than a proper asset. And worst of all, it has some NonBos with other cards in the deck. Glorious Protector can flash in to protect all our non-angel creatures in response to a board wipe, but we super can't use it when Maskwood Nexus is turning everything into an angel all the time already. It might turn it into a bunch of different creature types, but it turns off one of our protective spells. Maskwood Nexus isn't like horrible or anything, but I'd like to dare you to try the deck without the Nexus, and take notice of how often you just naturally accrue the necessary creature types without even having to try that hard. I really think we can do without this one. Okay, let's get even thornier. This is another non-creature cut. Smuggler's Share just barely scraped into the average deck list when I grabbed this list to start working on this video, but I'm booting it here. I guess I kind of agree with Rachel Weeks' take on this. This card has not blown me away like I thought it would. I've been keeping track of how this card performs in the games where I've played it, and in the last 2 games where I had it out, it drew me 1 card and it made 1 treasure. All game. I haven't given up on this card exactly, and that's very much just an anecdote. Don't take it as law. But if we're talking about card draw in this specific deck, well, then a creature card in this card slot would also draw us a card off of the folk hero. And if we're talking about treasure production, well, Burakos was already doing just fine for us, right? So I'm sorry, smugglers, I'm still holding out hope. But even if I'm wrong and this card is actually pretty darn cool, we have to admit that this commander deck probably needs these specific abilities less than some others, so I still think it's worth the cut. Okay, we've had some cuts, but let's pause for an addition here. I like Assault Intercessor a lot, and I really want to add it, but I need to pause to qualify it. This card is like half of Massacre Worm. It's Massacre Worm without the minus effect, and that life loss is awesome. This deck is very low to the ground, and this fella represents a significant amount of damage potential against the right opponent, especially against token players or aristocrat players. And since so many of our board wipes in this deck are one-sided, I really think that we can manipulate the crap out of this ability and really put enemies into a bind, and all with a simple 3-drop. Now, here's the problem. Technically, this card has NonBos with another card in the deck, Douthie Voidwalker, which would exile enemy creatures and prevent the death trigger. That's not ideal. However, this hasn't stopped the average deck from also running Revel and Riches, which also has a death trigger which would non-bow with Doughty Voidwalker. So clearly this average deck contains a couple of small anti-synergies like this, and overall I think this one is still worth it, particularly because we have a lot of control over this one. The Voidwalker can at any time sacrifice itself to grab a spell, so we're still able to manipulate things. I think it's worth it to jump through these types of hoops just to make sure that those token players don't feel all smug with their Avenger of Zendikars and instead live in fear that our single Assault Intercessor could totally delete them from the game in the event of a board wipe or a combat step that doesn't go the way they thought it would. This is a lot of potential damage in one little card. Let's give it the space to really do some work. Continuing with non-bows, here's yet another awkward thing in the average deck list too. Haunted One is a super fun background that has made its way into this average deck because Burakos shares a creature type with all of the creatures we have in the deck, so every time our commander attacks, we'll pump the whole team and give them Undying, making it easier for us to justify attacking with a bit more zeal and securing our creatures back to the battlefield in the event that they would perish in battle. However, this card again has some issues with cards in the deck already. Nalia, Mikaeus, Felisa, and even one of our protection spells all give things +1 counters, which would negate the Undying ability. And Formation would even give our stuff Vigilance, negating the Haunted One's effects completely because Burakos wouldn't even become tapped in the first place. So that's awkward, and instinctively, I think plenty of players would see that non-bow and say, okay, remove Haunted One because it's clearly the problem, right? Well, I like Haunted One a lot, so that's not what I'm going to do. Because the thing is, there are little non-bows all over this deck list. It's frankly kind of riddled with them. +1 counters pumping up our team would make some of our board wipes less one-sided, for instance. Glorious Protector wouldn't do diddly squat to protect Mikaeus because he'd come back with 0 counters and then just die immediately anyway. So little small anti-synergies or stumbling blocks are kind of everywhere, and I don't think that we can avoid every tiny anti-synergy the deck contains. But I also don't think we have to. We just have to pick our battles. And I gotta say, Mikaeus and Felisa stood out to me more as issues than Haunted One or any of the others did. Mikaeus is cool. He's just slow here. And Felisa is super awesome, but probably more for when Nalia is your party commander instead of when Burakos is your party commander. I'll be honest, Mikaeus being yet another cleric also made me extra critical of him, so that's worth noting too. He's got tough competition. I was tempted to keep Felisa just because she's a wizard and we're light on those, but she has almost no other +1 counter synergies in the deck to work with, so I decided to cut those two instead and I kept Haunted One here, and the protective spell, and Nalia. Because Nalia has awesome card advantage, and that protective spell is super flexible, and it really only has the anti-synergy in the event that we use it offensively rather than defensively. Okay, those are all our cuts, but now let's get adding. Here's one of the things that made me most excited to make a video about this commander. Vat of Rebirth is awesome here. Every time we crack a treasure token, this gets counters. Anytime our stuff dies, it gets counters, and it can just bring back one of our creatures all the time. We're making so many treasures. This card is silly easy to activate in this deck. Great insurance for a heavily creature-focused deck, and it's super cheap to get to. Super excited for this one. I probably should have mentioned the land count before now too, huh? 33 lands is pretty low. I don't normally endorse that. But stop me if you've heard this one, Burakos makes a ton of treasures. So this deck is actually in pretty constant danger of mana flood rather than mana screw. I'll just throw one more land in here to help with Burakos specifically though, and that's going to be Access Tunnel. Unblockable Burakos is best Burakos. We want those attack triggers, and this is a nice plan B in the event of a super crowded board. Also, I cut a wizard creature earlier, and that needs replacing. It's not just me, right? Smogsteed Rider is, really cool here. We attack, and suddenly you can't block us except with black or artifact creatures, so once again, Burakos has a sneaky way to get past enemy lines, and so do all of our pesky poking creatures as well. I think this card doesn't look like much at first glance, but when you're sitting across from it, you're suddenly like, oh, I need to find a board wipe right now because I'm playing Teamer and those unblockable creatures will be a problem. I know this is a 4-mana creature, so it doesn't hit any of those 3-mana or less payoffs, but the unique evasion that this creature offers is just so worth it. And finally, my last 2 additions are pretty self-indulgent, but I ask you to bear it with me. Activating Strionic Resonator on Burakos' triggered ability just feels so dang good. 8 life and 8 treasures, It's so silly, y'all. I can't help it. And speaking of doubling things up, Asterion has blown me away every time I have cast it in this deck. This is a wound reflection on a rogue. It's 6 mana, so I totally get why some folks are not into it. But I think we're allowed to have one over-the-top type of creature when its ability is this good at finishing the game, right? So much of this deck is chip damage. 4 life here, death triggers there, tons of tiny creatures with a small number of pump-up effects to increase our damage output mid-combat. Given all of that, Asterion is a little left field, but it turns all that chip damage into lethal so much faster than people expect it to. I love this card. It's only like 50 cents. At least give it a try. That's all I'm saying. And that's it for swaps, but now our honorable mentions. If you want to spruce this deck up with pricier cards, then really, the world is your oyster. There are tons of expensive on-type creatures, though admittedly, some of them get kinda cutthroat, so watch out for these depending on the game experience that you're hoping to cultivate. I know that as this deck upgrades with pricier creatures, some of the other smaller fare like Malakir Bloodpriest or a few others tend to fall down in the ranks in the data, which I'm really sad to see those go. Looping Malakir Bloodpriest is so fun for me, but I understand their departure compared to all of the other utility creatures the deck is already packing. Speaking of utility creatures, the thing that I wish we could have added into the main list was Giver of Runes, which is like $11 right now, but oh dang, is that a great one. And also, Timna the Weaver is, again, a cleric, but the card draw there is off the charts. It'd be great to upgrade this deck's removal as well. Deadly Rollick can be cast even if all we have is Folk Hero in play, because that enchantment is technically one of our commanders. And protective spells could be turned into Flawless Maneuver or the new Clever Concealment card for the same reason. Parties love nothing more than free stuff. But the ultimate addition, I think, is Reconnaissance. Attack with any creatures we want, and if they get into a scuffle that we don't like, we can pull them out of combat, still getting our treasures and life loss trigger. Plus, this card's reminder text is a lie. Entrenched players may be familiar with this already, but for folks who aren't acquainted, there's a part of the combat phase after creatures have dealt damage, but where they're still considered to be an attacking creature. This is where stuff like myriad creatures would go away at end of combat, for example. The damage is done, but there are still some abilities that can happen before we move on to the next main phase. During that time, you can use Reconnaissance to pull any creatures you attacked with out of combat, even though the damage step has already happened. So this card is insurance and free vigilance for the team. Definitely a great upgrade, if you don't mind explaining the nitty-gritty rules like that. Alright, that's our list done. The link for the deck is in the description, but you know what? We're gonna make a budget version of this deck too. Now, of course, the most cost-effective way to acquire a full Burakos list is probably just to get the precon, but why should that stop us? Budget brewing is fun. Let's make some upgrades to this current existing list that make it a whole lot easier on our wallet. There are more than a handful of cards here with high price tags, so let's chop them right out. Smothering Tithe, Voidwalker, Revel, Greaves, Anguished Unmaking, Godless Shrine, stuff like that. We're okay without them. To be safe, I'll also cut the Mutavault, Archivist, and the Black Market connections, even though I know they came in Burakos' precon deck. So players who are building this list may already actually have them, but I just want to make sure to provide budget alternatives anyway, just in case you end up using those cards in another deck, or if you traded them off, or if you're actually building this list from scratch, that sort of thing. So here's the budget chop, and now, what are we adding into the deck? Well, first, let it be said that you could totally re-include the creatures that I cut earlier, like Machaeus or Bygone Bishop and stuff like that if you wanted to. I won't personally be doing that in this budget section, but those would totally be fine to get back into the deck, because they were like just right on the cusp in the first section, you know? If you want to play those here again, that totally makes sense to me. I'd like to address a couple of other possible options, though. First, to replace the land we lost, I love Ash Barrens a bunch. Good color fixer that doesn't have to hit our tempo if we play things right. Great card. Then we lost a removal spell, and I'd love a little more interaction in general in this list. So let's get Generous Gift in here to replace the Anguished Unmaking we lost. And yes, at long last, I'm finally mentioning Deadly Alliance, the party removal spell. This is a cool card, though it's better when we're in the lead already and it's harder to use from behind, so that's why it's not my top priority for removal, but it's still a fantastic find for a practical and budget-minded player. And really, who can ever be mad at a thematic removal spell? Budget building also makes me more aware of some cool wizards that I think we'll like a lot too. Gisa can steal from people when their stuff dies, and while this might be kinda slow, it's also kinda awesome. Like, if this was a cleric, it would be lower in my evaluation, but we could use a few more wizards to balance things out, you know? Chronomancer eats treasures and spits out card draw. And I like that a little bit better than Bicod Bishop. And going even further, Radadrabic is Rad-a-Drabic. That joke is terrible, but I'm keeping it. We may not have a ton of legends in this list, but this card is destruction insurance for our commander, and that's pretty big. Someone kills our stuff and we'll end up with a leftover non-legendary commander, and then we can have 2 Burakoses when we replay our commander again next turn. Now that is party time. These are annoying wizards, so let's use them to really bother our opponents and stop them from successfully messing with our stuff. You know what, speaking of creatures, I've been mean to clerics a lot so far, so let's let one back into the club. Disciple of the Vault turns all those treasures we're making into an at-will ping machine. This is like the definition of an ankle biter card, and Burakos loves it. And finally, we don't have Lightning Greaves anymore, but that's okay. I said I wanted more interaction, and I think Sajiri will help us with that. It's flexible, it helps us stay consistent with our mana, but it's also a way to deflect removal that is sure to come our way when we start making bunches of mana and chunking enemy life totals. A simple trick goes a long way. We can call it a party favor. And bam! A budget Burakos build brewed brutally but beautifully. Both deck lists can be found down in the description box below, with the cuts in the maybe board. That's how I plan a party, but what about you? Let your fellow folk heroes know about your secret tech down in the comments below. Click all the good buttons down there, you know what they are, and thanks so much for watching.